I buried my father on a cold Tuesday morning, standing alone beside a worn wooden casket, while the wind cut through the empty cemetery like it was reminding me how forgotten I truly was. No family showed up, no friends, not even distant relatives who used to pretend they cared. It was just me, a priest who mispronounced my father's name, and a silence so heavy it felt like it could crush the little strength I had left. I kept waiting for someone, anyone, to appear, but no one did. And that told me more about my father's life than any eulogy ever could. As I walked away from the grave, boots sinking into the wet grass, I felt a strange mix of anger and sadness twisting in my chest. My father and I had never been close, but I never imagined his funeral would feel like this. Like he vanished from the world without leaving a single ripple behind. I tried to shake the feeling that something was missing, something he never told me, something he took with him into the ground. But life moved on, or at least it pretended to, and I returned home trying to accept that nothing about this story would ever make sense. A week later, just as I was beginning to settle back into the dull routine of grief, a knock echoed through my house. Slow, firm, intentional. When I opened the door, a stranger in a dark suit stood on my porch, holding a thin envelope pressed against his chest like it weighed more than gold. He didn't introduce himself at first. He just looked at me with eyes that carried both pity and something else, something like hesitation. Then he finally said, in a low voice that sent chills through me, "I'm here on behalf of your father, and you need to see this." I stared at the envelope, confused and uneasy, because my father never left anything for anyone. Not affection, not explanations, and certainly not surprises. But the stranger insisted, placing the envelope gently in my hands as if it were a fragile secret waiting to explode. "This," he said, "changes everything you thought you knew about him." And right then, before I even opened it, I felt it. Something was wrong. Something big. Something my father had hidden his entire life. When I finally slid my finger beneath the seal and unfolded the first page, my breath caught in my throat. The words written inside didn't just surprise me. They shattered everything. "My name is Ethan Miller, and I grew up in a small town called Crestwood, a quiet place surrounded by long roads, tall pines, and people who knew every detail of your life, except the ones that truly mattered. My father, Thomas Miller, lived on the edge of town in a faded white house with chipped paint and a porch that creaked even on windless days. He was a private man, distant in a way that made you wonder if he was still holding on to something from a past he refused to talk about. And no matter how close I tried to get growing up, he always kept a wall between us, one built from silence more than anger. I left Crestwood at 19, escaping the weight of that silence the moment I could. My father never stopped me, never asked where I was going, never offered advice or warning, just nodded once, like he already knew I wouldn't come back for a long time. And he was right. I only returned years later when the hospital called to tell me he was gone. No final words, no explanation, no family waiting in the lobby, just me, standing at a front desk, staring at a medical chart that felt colder than the man himself ever had. The only other person who knew my father well was an old neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, a retired school teacher with silver hair tied in a bun and a habit of watching everything from her window. She had lived next door to my father for nearly 30 years, and she always insisted he was a complicated soul carrying a heavy story. I never understood what she meant. She often left pies on his porch and claimed he always seemed grateful, even though he barely spoke. When she saw me after the funeral, she hugged me tightly, whispering, "Your father wasn't the man people thought he was." At the time, I dismissed it as something people say to soften grief, but now I wasn't so sure. Then there was Dr. Samuel Clark, the town's quiet, middle-aged physician who handled most of my father's medical care. He was the one who called me when my father passed, his voice low and respectful, though I sensed something more underneath. He kept asking if my father had told me anything, or if he had mentioned his affairs. I brushed it off, thinking it was about outstanding medical bills. But looking back, the way he said it felt loaded, almost like he was tiptoeing around a secret he wasn't allowed to reveal. And now, with the lawyer's envelope in my hand, every odd moment with him suddenly made sense. Crestwood may be small, but it was full of memories, some sharp, some blurry, and some I had locked away long before adulthood. Places like Miller's Diner, where my father used to drink black coffee at the same booth every Saturday morning, or the worn-down hardware store where he worked repairing tools in the back, always with the same quiet focus. People whispered that he lived a lonely life, but I always suspected loneliness wasn't his choice. It was his shield. What I never imagined was that the life he built in silence held truths that would shake mine from the ground up. And as I sat at my kitchen table, the lawyer's envelope open in front of me, I realized something unsettling. Every person connected to my father had known more about him than I did, and maybe that's exactly what he intended. The lawyer, a tall man in his late 50s with a salt and pepper beard, introduced himself as Richard Hayes from a firm 2 towns over, far more prestigious than anything someone in Crestwood would normally use. He sat across from me at my kitchen table, folding his hands carefully, as if preparing to deliver news that required precision. "Your father contacted us 7 months ago," he began, his voice steady but strangely gentle. "He left specific instructions regarding matters he felt you needed to know." I blinked, confused. My father. Instructions. He barely spoke to me, let alone planned something like this. The confusion twisted deeper when the lawyer slid a second envelope toward me, thicker, heavier, sealed with wax. I hesitated before picking it up. The weight of it felt wrong, like something that didn't belong to the man I thought I knew. Richard continued. "He prepared a formal will, but what you're holding, that's something he insisted be given to you personally." That sentence alone sent a chill through my spine. My father wasn't sentimental. He didn't write letters. He barely wrote grocery lists. So why would he leave something just for me? I slowly broke the seal and unfolded the pages, expecting maybe a few lines, an apology, or some cryptic message. But instead, I found paragraphs, long, detailed paragraphs, written in handwriting I hadn't seen since childhood. The first line made my hands tremble. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means the past has finally caught up with me." I stared at those words, my heart pounding harder with each breath. What past? What was he talking about? I looked up at the lawyer, hoping for answers, but his expression remained carefully neutral, like someone trained not to reveal more than allowed. I continued reading, scanning sentences that hinted at secrets he'd carried for decades, mistakes he couldn't undo, people he couldn't face, choices that changed the course of his life long before I was born. But the letter didn't explain everything. It danced around the truth, as if he wanted me to search for it, rather than simply receive it. Then Richard opened his briefcase and placed a smaller document in front of me, the official will. "Before you read further," he said softly, "you should understand that this is not a typical inheritance case." My stomach tightened as I opened the will and scanned the first few lines. My father had divided his assets, what little he had, into categories with labels I didn't recognize. Land deeds from counties I'd never heard of. Bank accounts I didn't know existed. A locked storage unit in a town nearly 3 hours away. None of it made sense. He was a hardware store repairman, a quiet, solitary man. Where did all this come from? But the final line of the first page is what made my breath hitch. "All remaining funds, accounts, and properties, listed and unlisted, are to be transferred solely to my son, Ethan Miller." I looked up sharply, confused, almost disoriented. "Listed and unlisted?" I asked, voice breaking. The lawyer nodded once, slowly. "Your father had assets that were not part of his public life, and he gave explicit instructions for you to receive everything." My pulse quickened. a mixture of fear and disbelief swirling inside me. And then Richard leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing with careful weight. "Before we continue, there's something else you need to see. Something he said might change how you remember him." And that's when he pulled out a small wooden box sealed with a metal clasp, something I had never seen before, but somehow instantly recognized. Richard placed the small wooden box on the table, as if it were something fragile, something with a heartbeat of its own. The wood was dark, worn, carved with initials I didn't recognize. As he slid it toward me, he let out a quiet breath. "Your father wanted you to understand who he really was, and why so many people kept their distance." The words hit me like a cold wave. I thought no one came to the funeral because my father lived a lonely life or because he pushed people away. But the way Richard said it sounded like the absence wasn't just neglect. It was deliberate, heavy, loaded with guilt. My fingers brushed the lid, and for a moment, I felt like I was touching a part of him I had never been allowed to see. When I finally opened the box, I expected maybe photographs or old trinkets. Instead, I found letters, dozens of them, tied together with a frayed piece of twine. Each envelope carried a name I knew from town, old neighbors, former co-workers, even the pastor who refused to attend the burial. They were letters written to people who never showed up at the funeral. And the first one I opened made my chest tighten. It wasn't a message of bitterness. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a confession. A quiet, painful confession of a mistake my father made decades ago, something that caused harm, something he never stopped carrying. And in the margins, in small, shaky handwriting, he wrote, "I never expected them to forgive me. I just wanted them to know I remembered." I sat there stunned, the room suddenly spinning in slow motion. My father hadn't lived alone out of choice. He'd lived alone out of consequence. And the people who stayed away from the funeral, they weren't heartless. They were ashamed. I opened another letter, this one addressed to Mr. Hollis, an old friend of his. It said, "If I ever lifted my head in town again, it would have been a reminder of what he lost because of me." The more I read, the more I understood. My father wasn't avoiding people. People were avoiding the guilt attached to his memory. Not a single person had come to his funeral, because facing his coffin meant facing their own regrets. As the weight of the truth settled in, I felt something I never expected to feel. Sympathy. Deep, aching sympathy for a man who spent his life drowning in mistakes he couldn't undo, surrounded by people who punished themselves by pretending he no longer existed. Richard watched me carefully and said, "Your father carried more remorse than most men can survive. He didn't want to burden you with his past, but he didn't want you to misunderstand why nobody came." I swallowed hard, the silence between us thick with revelation. Suddenly, the empty cemetery made sense, the cold wind, the loneliness. It wasn't abandonment, it was shame. Then Richard pulled one last letter from his briefcase, separate from the others. "This," he said quietly, "is the one he asked me to give you only after you opened the box." My hand shook as I unfolded it. Unlike the others, this letter was short, only one line written in shaky, fading ink. "Ethan, I never knew how to love you right, but I never stopped hoping you'd have a life better than mine. Everything I leave is yours, because you deserve the chance I never took." My breath broke. The room fell silent, and for the first time since his death, I felt something I didn't expect. Connection. A fragile, painful, overdue connection to the man I thought I had lost long before the funeral. Richard cleared his throat gently, as if preparing me for something even heavier. "There's one more item listed in the will," he said, sliding a document across the table. "But before you read it, you need to understand, your father wasn't the man Crestwood believed him to be. But he also wasn't the man you thought he was." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. I unfolded the document slowly, expecting something simple, maybe an old truck, a storage unit full of junk, maybe a piece of land nobody wanted. But instead, I saw the name of a company I had never heard before, and beneath it, a number so large I blinked twice to make sure I wasn't misreading it. My father owned 46% of a private manufacturing company valued in the millions. I stared at the page in disbelief. Richard continued softly. He invested in it nearly 30 years ago. It started as a small workshop with 2 employees. He never talked about it, never touched the profits, never used the money. Every dividend, every payout, every share increase, he kept it untouched. My mouth went dry. My father, who lived frugally, wore the same boots for years, and worked quietly repairing tools, had been sitting on a fortune he never spent a single dollar of. I felt shock surge through me like electricity. This didn't make sense. None of it did. Why hide something like this? Richard looked at me with a tired, knowing expression. He didn't believe he deserved it, he said, and he didn't want anyone in town to know. He only cared about leaving something meaningful behind. For you. My heart pounded against my ribs. I felt a mix of gratitude and confusion and anger all swirling together. The man who left me emotionally hungry my entire life had been preparing a silent legacy for me for decades. The idea felt surreal, almost unreal, like I was reading a story about someone else. But the signature at the bottom of the document, Thomas A. Miller, was unmistakably his. Before I could process it, Richard reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a small black envelope. This was the last part of his instructions, he said. He told me this would answer the one question you would eventually ask. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single photograph, an old, faded picture of my father standing with 2 men I had never seen before. Behind them was the company's original workshop. On the back of the photograph, in familiar handwriting, were the words, "This is where I tried to become a better man." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting everything sink in. The silence in the room felt different now, not empty, not cold, but heavy with the weight of a man I never truly understood. My father wasn't a ghost. He wasn't heartless. He wasn't absent out of cruelty. He was a flawed man who buried his mistakes deep and tried, in his own quiet way, to build something better for me. And now, through this unexpected fortune, through these letters, through this final attempt at connection, he was still trying. I looked up at Richard, feeling something shift inside me, something like forgiveness, though not fully formed yet. "Is this everything?" I asked, voice barely louder than a whisper. Richard shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "There's one more person you need to talk to, someone your father mentioned by name, and someone who's been waiting for you to find all this." And just like that, the story wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the truth he left behind. Richard hesitated before speaking the name, as if weighing the impact it would have on me. "Her name is Margaret Dawson," he said finally. "Your father requested that you meet her after reading the will. He insisted she would fill the gaps he couldn't fix." I frowned. The name meant nothing to me. Dawson wasn't a common name in Crestwood, and I certainly didn't remember meeting anyone who fit that description. But the way Richard said it felt like she wasn't just another character in my father's life. It felt like she was a missing piece. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice low and cautious. Richard closed his briefcase and replied, "Someone who knew the version of your father the town never saw." The following morning, I drove to the address Richard gave me, a small, quiet farmhouse on the outskirts of Crestwood, the kind of place where the road narrows and the world seems to pause for a moment. As I stepped out of the car, the front door opened slowly, and a woman in her 70s walked out with a cardigan wrapped tightly around her. Her gray hair was pinned back neatly, and her glasses rested low on her nose. She looked at me with a mixture of recognition and heartbreak. "You're Thomas's boy," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I froze. There was something familiar in her tone, something warm, something that made my chest tighten. She invited me inside, and the moment I stepped into her living room, I saw them, framed photos on her walls and shelves, dozens of them, and in nearly every one, standing beside her, smiling awkwardly in his quiet way, was my father, younger, healthier, softer. I stared at the images, shocked, as she poured tea and sat across from me. "Your father came here every Sunday," she said gently, "for almost 20 years. I gripped the armrest of the chair. "He never told me about you," I said, barely above a whisper. She nodded sadly. "He didn't tell many people about us, especially not you. That was his biggest regret." My breath hitched. Regret? For what? Margaret reached for a small wooden frame and turned it toward me. It was a picture of her, my father, and a little boy, no older than 7, standing between them. My heart nearly stopped. "Who is that?" I whispered. She lowered her gaze. "My grandson," she said, her voice cracking, "and the child your father swore to protect." My pulse hammered against my ribs. She continued, "Years ago, my daughter married a man who got in with the wrong crowd. When things went bad, your father stepped in. He paid their debts, shielded them from consequences, and nearly lost everything trying to give that child a chance." I felt the ground shift beneath me. My father, who lived quietly, who seemed so detached, had been fighting battles I never knew about. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked, struggling to breathe evenly. Margaret took a slow breath. "Because he thought you resented him enough already. He didn't want to burden you with his past, or with the people he tried to save." She leaned back, tears forming. "But he regretted the distance between you. Deeply. He talked about you every week. He kept every photo you mailed him as a child. And even when you left, he always said the same thing. Ethan will become better than me. He deserves a life untouched by my mistakes." I felt something inside me collapse, not in pain, but in realization. My father hadn't been cold. He had been protecting me in the only way he knew how, by keeping me far from the darkness he couldn't escape. Margaret placed a small envelope in my hands, her fingers trembling. "He left this with me," she said softly. "He said you would only believe the truth if it came from someone who saw it happen." I opened it carefully, my breath catching as I unfolded the short handwritten note inside. "I wasn't a good father, but I tried to be a good man. I hope someday you'll understand the difference." Tears blurred my vision. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had truly met the real Thomas Miller. But Margaret wasn't finished. She looked at me with a heavy expression and said, "There's something else you need to know. Something your father asked me to show you last. And Ethan." She paused, swallowing. "It's the part that explains why no one came to his funeral, and why they all regret it now." Margaret stood slowly, her hands trembling as she walked toward an old cabinet against the far wall. She opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, bound with a brittle rubber band. When she placed it in my hands, I felt a heaviness that went beyond paper. Everything the town hides, everything they pretended to forget. "It's all here," she said softly. Her voice wasn't dramatic, it was exhausted, like someone who had carried the truth alone for too long. I looked into her eyes and saw something I'd never expected. The same sadness I used to see in my father's. The sadness of someone who'd watched an entire community judge a man without ever knowing the real story. I opened the folder carefully, and the first thing I saw was a faded newspaper clipping from 28 years ago. A headline jumped out at me. "Local man takes the fall in financial scandal. Business partners cleared." My heart dropped. I scanned the article, my eyes racing through lines that painted my father as the villain of a scheme he didn't start. According to the article, he had acted alone. But as I read the documents tucked behind it, signed statements, handwritten notes, legal drafts, I realized the truth was far more tragic. My father didn't act alone. He protected the two men in the photograph, the same company founders he stood beside in that picture. He took responsibility for their crime so they could rebuild their lives. And in doing so, he destroyed his own reputation. Margaret's voice cut through the silence. "They begged him not to take the blame," she said, her eyes shining with distant memory. "But he insisted. He told them someone had to stay behind to clean up the mess, and they had children, families. He said his own son was still young and deserved a future untainted by all this." She wiped a tear, her voice breaking. But the town only saw what they wanted to see. They believed the headline. They turned their backs on him. And when the truth finally came out years later, they were too ashamed to face him. A deep ache spread through my chest. The empty funeral wasn't abandonment. It was guilt carved into silence. I flipped through more documents, each one revealing a deeper glimpse into the life my father lived. Letters from those same founders, apologies he never answered, bank statements showing the company's success, yet not a single withdrawal from the account under his name. He had let their success grow while choosing to remain invisible. He made himself the shadow so others could step into the light. Margaret placed a hand over mine. He carried their sins so they could raise their families without shame. But people only see what's printed in bold letters. They never saw the sacrifice behind it. A sickening realization hit me. So, the town avoided him not because they hated him, but because they were ashamed they ever believed the lie. Margaret nodded. Yes, for years. They didn't know how to look him in the eye after learning the truth. They tried to apologize, but your father refused to meet anyone. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want to hear excuses. He just wanted to live quietly and leave something good behind. She exhaled shakily. And when he died, none of them had the courage to show up. They couldn't stand beside the grave of a man they had failed. I closed the folder slowly, my throat tightening as the pieces finally fit together. My father hadn't been a cold man. He'd been a man who carried the weight of other people's mistakes. A man who loved in a silent, self-destructive way. A man who believed protecting others meant isolating himself. Margaret looked at me with soft, grieving eyes. He wasn't perfect, Ethan, but he was good, and goodness often goes unnoticed until it's too late. Her words wrapped around me like a truth I had been searching for my entire life. Then she reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small silver key, placing it gently into my hand. "This," she whispered, "is what he wanted you to see last. The final piece of the story. What he left behind isn't just money, or land, or a company. It's something far more personal." I felt the cool metal press against my palm, and a chill ran through me. "What does it open?" I asked quietly. Margaret looked toward the window, her expression heavy with meaning. "It opens the place he never had the courage to enter again, the place he built for you." The key felt cold in my hand as I left Margaret's house, the weight of everything she'd revealed settling deep in my chest. For the first time in years, I wasn't angry at my father. I was overwhelmed by the kind of love that hurts because it keeps giving even when nobody sees it. When I reached his old property, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet porch. The keyhole on the small side door looked untouched, almost waiting for me. My hand trembled as I slid the key in and turned it, hearing a soft, reluctant click that felt like a breath held for decades finally being released. Inside, the air was still, carrying the faint smell of old books and something warm, wood, maybe, or memories that never had the chance to breathe. The room wasn't large, but it was filled with things that made my heart stop for a moment. On one wall, shelves held notebooks labeled with my name, each dated through the years I'd been growing up, each one filled with notes. Ethan's first day of school. Ethan's science fair. Ethan loves drawing, encourage him. They were milestones he never got to celebrate with me, yet he'd recorded them from a distance, collecting what he never said out loud. It was the quietest form of fatherhood, and suddenly, it meant everything. Next to the shelves, a workbench held small wooden carvings, dozens of them, animals, little houses, trees, and a series of tiny boats, each with my initials carved underneath. He had made something for every year of my life. Some were shaky, some were smooth and polished, but they all carried the marks of time, patience, and a kind of devotion I never imagined he had. In the center of the room sat a sealed envelope resting on a simple wooden box. My name was written on it in his careful handwriting. My knees nearly gave out. I opened the letter slowly, every fold a heartbeat. "Ethan," it began, "I know I failed you in ways a father shouldn't. I didn't know how to be the man you needed after everything. But I tried in the only ways I understood. I built this room because I couldn't give you the moments face to face. I hoped that someday you'd see I never stopped being your father, even when it looked like I turned away." His words blurred as tears hit the page. "You deserved more than silence. I'm sorry you had to wait this long to hear the truth. Use what I left for you to live freely. And forgive me, if one day your heart allows it." Inside the wooden box was a small silver compass, simple, worn, beautifully kept. It wasn't valuable in money, but it meant something far greater. There was another note tucked beneath it. "I kept this from your first camping trip. You dropped it in the river and cried for an hour. I told you it would find its way back to you someday. Everything does." I held the compass to my chest, realizing this wasn't inheritance. It was reconciliation across years of misunderstanding. It was a man speaking from beyond his own mistakes. When I stepped out of that small room and locked it behind me, I didn't feel alone anymore. I felt connected to a story I never knew I was part of. My father didn't leave me wealth, he left me truth. And standing there in the golden light of the setting sun, I understood why no one had come to the funeral. Their absence wasn't cruelty, it was shame, regret, the heavy price people pay when they realize too late that a good man walked among them. I took a long breath, letting the past settle. It didn't disappear, but it softened. Now, before we close this chapter, let me leave you with something your heart might need right now. If this story moved you, if it made you think about forgiveness, about second chances, about the hidden battles people fight alone, there is another story you can't miss. It's right here on your screen, on the left. It's about the man whose wife declared him gone while he fought for his life, and what happened the day he came home. Trust me, you need to see how that one ends.